These are the three things that Bryan Johnson is missing from his longevity routine. Bryan Johnson is an entrepreneur who sold his company Braintree Venmo to PayPal in 2013 for $800 million. He now identifies as the world's most measured human, and his goal is to use his Project Blueprint, a longevity project on which he spends $2 million a year to bring longevity strategies to the common person for the benefit of all humanity. As a PhD in Nutritional Sciences with over 20 years of research, including the vetting of hundreds of biomarkers, these are the three key types of data that I believe Johnson is missing, and what I think we can discard from his plan, what can be improved, and what you can learn from this to apply in your own journey toward a longer and healthier life on a budget of far less than $2 million a year. So Bryan Johnson's goal is to use the research of his team on promising, published anti-aging strategies that his team can then deliver to him as things that he should put into his stack. Then he self-experiments on what that addition to his stack did. And if he likes the results, he keeps it in the stack. He's gone to some crazy lengths to try to find longevity secrets. For example, he injected himself 6 times with 1 liter of his son's blood before determining that it had no positive impact in the context of his stack, but he still gives his dad his blood because it does seem to be helping his dad. He's committed to sleeping alone, and his diet is extremely regimented. He spends millions of dollars on self-experimentation, but he is well aware of and empathetic to the fact that others do not have these resources, and his hope is he can use them on himself to find strategies that are going to benefit all of humanity as we move into a future where death can be transcended through science. Now, I personally love that Johnson is open-minded, data-driven, action-oriented, and responsive to criticism. I love his philosophy of automating the small things in life in order to make room to achieve bigger things. Let the data tell me what to eat so I can spend my time building businesses, expanding philosophy, or creating art. And let's do the dirty work in our generation so that future generations can dream bigger dreams. But you may be asking yourself, does living a long, healthy life require us to lose our life trying to save it? Do we have to commit most of our time and resources towards finding a way to incrementally age more slowly? A lot of you might be asking, how do I get the 80-20 of this? What are the small number of things that I can take out of this routine that will give me the most important results? Now, you may want to lengthen your lifespan and health span without losing the opportunity to eat freely of enjoyable foods, to sleep with your partner, or spend most of your money or your day managing your health. And understanding this is actually critical because harmful processes that occur with aging accelerate over time. And it's quite possible that each day we go without optimizing what's accessible to us gets us closer to the point of damage becoming irreversible. So let's start this discussion right now before the opportunity to live better escapes us. In this analysis, I'm going to be looking for things that Johnson is doing that may be holding his results back, blind spots in the data that he's measuring, and accessible ways to simplify his approach. In this analysis, I relied on the articles from his website that's linked in the description, mainly his monthly notes, his current results and protocol, as well as some of the posts that he made on social media. So central finding of my analysis is that he's missing 3 types of data. Number 1, functional markers of nutrients. Number 2, markers of bottlenecks in energy metabolism. And number 3, ranked and sorted genetics to find the small number of mutations with high impact that are unique to him, rather than focusing broadly on any of his genetics that seem relevant. These missing data sets prevent him from recognizing some aspects of his protocol or things that he should add to his protocol that are highly unique to him. Paradoxically, better understanding this would actually help him spread high-impact strategies to the masses because everyone has things that are highly unique to them, so everyone should have a strategy for figuring out what they are. Let's start by talking about how Johnson's 25% caloric deficit caused reversible infertility. One principle that emerges from this is Johnson is focused on restricting his energy intake without focusing on how to make sure the energy that he does have flows down the path of least resistance so that it can be invested in the most important health promoting investments. If we look at his caloric restriction, I believe that Johnson would agree with me that his 25% caloric deficit was too extreme. He recently concluded the same. His 25% caloric deficit lowered his testosterone, which made him supplement with using a patch to bring the testosterone back up. And the combination of the caloric deficit with the testosterone, which exerts negative feedback on testicular activity, led his sperm levels and the functionality of his sperm to drop. The metrics that he had on the 25% caloric deficit clearly indicated infertility. He had 3% normal sperm, 81% immotile sperm, and 6 times lower functional sperm per ejaculation than he now has on a less severe caloric deficit. When he shifted from a 25% caloric deficit to a 10% caloric deficit, this allowed him to stop the testosterone, and his sperm profile improved to 11% normal, 38% immotile, and 6 times greater numbers of functional sperm per ejaculation than he had on the previous larger caloric deficit. So what he's done is on a 25% caloric deficit, he moved from infertile to, on a 10% caloric deficit, average for a healthy adult fertile male. The way that the caloric deficit taxed his body was probably by decreasing his sensitivity to thyroid hormone. One of the things that he posted is that his T3, T4, and TSH were all normal, despite the fact that his body temperature lowered 4 degrees on his protocol to 94.9 degrees Fahrenheit, which is low. Now, even though he's saying that his thyroid markers are normal, he's not taking into account the decrease in sensitivity to thyroid hormone that you would expect under those conditions. Why would you expect that? Because caloric restriction raises free fatty acids. What do free fatty acids do? They interfere with thyroid hormone being transported in the blood. And then much more importantly, once the thyroid hormone gets into the cell, it needs to bind to a nuclear receptor in order to raise the metabolic rate through the effects on gene transcription. And free fatty acids interfere with the thyroid hormone binding to its nuclear receptor. So even though his blood levels of thyroid hormone are normal, the physiological effect that you would expect from a raised metabolic rate, namely higher body temperature, that has massively tanked. And that presumably is from lowered sensitivity to thyroid hormone. That decrease in the metabolic rate is going to decrease sex hormone synthesis, and it's also going to decrease investments of energy in fertility and long-term health. And so the combination of that with the negative feedback from supplemental testosterone on testicular activity is likely what explains the infertility indicated by his sperm profile. Now, the question remains, is the 10% caloric deficit that he currently has improving his lifespan? And should we expect it to improve ours? Now, while many papers claim that the effective caloric restriction is consistent in lengthening life across species, these studies are biased by using strains of animals that do benefit from caloric restriction. In an analysis of 41 strains of mice tested in parallel, randomized to ad libitum, meaning eat whatever they want, whenever they want, or caloric restriction, there were more strains of mice that had their lifespans shortened by caloric restriction than there were strains of mice that had their lifespans lengthened by caloric restriction. Further, there was no correlation between lifespan under ad libitum conditions and under calorically restricted conditions. In other words, there were genetic determinants, meaning some strains did better, lived longer than others. There were genetic determinants that applied to ad libitum conditions that were different from the genetic determinants that lengthened life under calorically restricted conditions. And so this means that we cannot generalize from one mouse to another whether caloric restriction is going to lengthen their life. So we certainly can't generalize between mice and humans or between one human and another. So one thing that is overwhelmingly clear is that energy is needed to invest in both fertility and longevity, and that too much detracts from both. And this is because, on the one hand, energy is needed to regenerate tissues, to keep telomeres long, to repair DNA, to defend against oxidative stress. And then on the other hand, too much energy stored as fat becomes a stress. Adipose mass has as it gets larger, the fat cells enlarge by retaining triglycerides, and they start to smush together, and they prevent the vascularization from delivering oxygen and nutrients to the fat cells that are needed for normal metabolism. This then leads to a stress signal that is signaled through inflammation. Systemic inflammation goes up. This plays an important role in the immune system coming to remodel the adipose tissue for better vascularization, but it comes at the expense of diverting energy away from fertility, away from longevity, and into the immune inflammatory response to remodel the adipose tissue. So if we're looking at this, there's certainly a commonality in why we need to not be fat and we need to not be underweight for longevity and fertility. It's just that the rest of it that would be where the benefits would be delivered through more extreme caloric restriction than is needed to just maintain a healthy body composition is all dependent on unknown genetics. Now, if we just look at the population data and say, okay, what portion of this caloric deficit versus body composition issue is broadly applicable to everyone, we can just look at the population data on mortality. So what we see is that both underweight and overweight both increase mortality, meaning they shorten lifespan or they decrease longevity. And the association with underweight, despite some criticisms of this nature, cannot be explained by smoking status, which lowers weight, or by pre-existing illness, which can also lower weight. It is independent of that. And when we look at body composition more precisely, fat mass increases mortality and fat-free mass decreases mortality. So it's not about body mass, it's about body composition. However, you don't need to be super lean or super muscular to reap the maximal benefit of body composition. So if we look at the fat mass, the lowest fat individuals are not the ones that live the longest. It's actually the second lowest quartile of fat mass. So that means that the people who are between the 25, the leanest 25% of individuals, not those, it's the next 25% that are between the 25th and 50th percentiles. Those are the ones who are living the longest. And if we look at the males and females pooled together, their average body fat percentage is in the mid 20s or even as high as 28%. So probably that's reflecting that females need more fat mass than males. But the point is, you don't need to be super lean in order to reap those benefits. And if we look at the fat-free mass, it's not about being as jacked as possible. It's simply about being in the upper half of the population. So the 80-20 on body composition is that you want to stay away from both extremes of fat mass. You don't want to be overly lean you don't want to be overweight, and you don't want to be obese. You want your BMI between 18 and 25, and keeping it there, you want to be in the upper half, meaning you look around and you are more muscular than every 1 out of 2 people around you, then you're good. And that's the 80-20 of body composition. It is not about being at the extremes. And obviously, there's going to be an individual variation between one person and another. The best way that you can individualize this to yourself is probably to just see how low you can get your high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is a marker of systemic inflammation, by optimizing your body composition. So if you optimize your body composition to the point where you get the maximal drop in high sensitivity CRP that you can get, then you've probably done what you need to do on body composition. Now, to say that you want to be more muscular than every 1 out of 2 people around you, that you don't want to be overweight and that you don't want to be underweight, to say that is not to say that you want to run a 10% or a 25% caloric deficit. So now let's ask the question, why might there be such genetic variation in the response to caloric restriction? How can we think about that, and what should we do about it? So there's room for debate, but my contention would be that there are 2 camps of people. The people who benefit from caloric restriction beyond what's needed to maintain healthy body composition are people who have genetic impairments in metabolism that increase the accumulation of neurotoxins and cardiotoxins, mainly from the fat and protein in their diet. So these bottlenecks, as I've covered in the past, especially in my Super Unlock video, which I'll link to in the description, as I've covered, we all have 1 or 2 hugely important genetic mutations that impact our energy metabolism. A lot of those, hundreds of them, will increase the accumulation of toxins from the food that we eat. And my suspicion is that the people who benefit most from caloric restriction are the people that fall into that camp. On the other hand, there are people with other mutations, and there are also hundreds of these, where the primary problem is energy deficiency. If your primary bottleneck in your energy metabolism is to drop your level of ATP, I believe that you are probably going to be hurt by caloric restriction in net when looking at longevity. So this is my hypothesis. It's my particular spin on it, but I think that's why there is so much genetic variation in the lifespan response to caloric restriction. Now, one approach that Johnson could use from among the tools he already has in his kit is to do serial measurements with his biological aging clock. He focuses on the Dunedin pace aging clock. I've actually used this myself. I drew the first sample a few days ago to enter Bryan Johnson's Rejuvenation Olympics. He could use this marker to see whether 25%, 10%, or 0% caloric deficits before and after measurements, which of those is best impacting when everything else is controlled, his rate of aging. And that would be a good preliminary way to think about that. Now, I do think that there are better ways to do that. And that comes down to one of the critical things that is missing from his measurements are to measure energetic bottlenecks, idiosyncratic bottlenecks in energy metabolism. And the reason that you could use this to better look at this would be to go back to exactly what I was saying before about whether you fall into the camp where energy deficiency is your primary problem, or you fall into the camp where accumulation of toxins developed during metabolism from the food that you eat is your primary problem. And measuring things like respiratory chain function, amino acids, organic acids, acylcarnitines, and acylglycines are ways that you can look at where is your primary bottleneck in your metabolism, and would that put you better into a caloric restriction approach or a calorically neutral, just focused on healthy body composition approach. But more important to that, you would be able to see what was nutritionally actionable about those bottlenecks to help remove them and to allow energy to flow down the path of least resistance so that that energy can be invested optimally in long-term health. Now, it's hard to tell from Johnson's data whether his energy metabolism is optimized in that way. Certainly his approach is focusing on caloric restriction, but what we would want to look to try to see whether energy is flowing down the path of least resistance into the most optimal investment in his long-term health would be to see if he is on his protocol decreasing the rate of aging and improving the rate of regeneration in all his tissues across the board. If you are systemically improving your energy metabolism, that energy is going to flow into everything to benefit you, not into just specific areas. Now, Johnson engages in a lot of tissue-specific anti-aging strategies that could mask whether his energy metabolism is systemically optimized, as well as certain strategies that could hack the biological clocks in a way that further takes clarity away from answering this question. For example, he uses the Ginfinity intracellular NAD test and uses nicotinamide riboside or nicotinamide mononucleotide, NR or NMN, to bring the NAD levels up. But this supplementation alone can lower the rate of aging on biological clocks. Now we have to ask the question, does that mean that it is systemically improving cross-tissue energy metabolism? What it's probably doing is, because NAD, a derivative of niacin that can be boosted with NR or NMN, because NAD is used as a label during the process of DNA repair, when it runs low, you can't label things correctly and you can't recruit energy repair enzymes to repair DNA. And so boosting NAD levels back up to age appropriate levels or back up to healthy optimal levels will at least marginally improve the rate of DNA repair and will slow that aspect of aging. The problem with that is that the reason DNA needs to be repaired in the first place is not because of NAD deficiency usually. That's just bottlenecking the repair process. The underlying contributor to the DNA damage in the first place is oxidative stress, and a deficiency in any antioxidant nutrient or a deficiency in energy metabolism, since energy is the fuel of the antioxidant defense system, is going to go left unfixed if you are just coming in at the level of damage control to improve DNA repair with NAD boosting strategies. So I'm not saying that replacing the NAD is harmful. It's just that it's not fixing the whole thing, and it is likely improving the biological aging clock test more than it is improving the overall state of energy metabolism. Now, the reason, again, that we want to know whether his energy is flowing down the path of least resistance is because we want energy to be invested in all of these other things, not just in DNA repair. This includes maintenance of excellent skin and hair, regenerating tissues, optimizing immune function, keeping blood vessels healthy, and preventing tissues from becoming cancerous. Johnson uses a custom hair formulation that includes caffeine, finasteride, minoxidil, azelaic acid, diclofenac, tea tree oil, rosemary oil, ginkgo biloba, biotin, and melatonin on his hair. And he's said that by his genetics, he should be bald already, and that he's unsatisfied with the effect size of this formulation, but he's nevertheless gotten his baldness index down to age 26 and his gray-white hair index down to age 41, both of which are younger than his chronological age of 46. Now, while his genetic issues may predispose him to problems with his hair, this really is biasing the effect of poor energy metabolism to go into the hair by topically applying things that encourage that investment. For example, minoxidil acts by mimicking the effects of ATP to open up channels that improve the delivery of nutrients and oxygen into the hair follicle. And if you optimize your ATP production, you would have systemic effects that invested energy naturally into your hair as well as the rest of your body, rather than mimicking the effect of high energy status with a topical drug. On his skin, he uses tretinoin, which mimics the effect of the NAD plus dependent activation of vitamin A into retinoic acid. Now, his use of the Ginfinity intracellular NAD test does not tell him whether he has a high ratio of NAD plus to NADH, which is what is going to determine whether he is capable of activating vitamin A to retinoic acid to support regeneration of his skin. And so if he had been looking at tests like the lactate to pyruvate ratio or the ratio of beta hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate, he would be able to make that inference and understand whether his vitamin A is being activated well, but he doesn't test those markers of energy metabolism, so he's not able to make that inference. All he's testing is the vitamin A level in the blood, which is adequate, but that has to drive you to the question, why does he need to apply activated vitamin A mimics to his skin topically if he is using that vitamin A properly? And the answer is that he probably is not, due to underlying problems in energy metabolism. He uses the eye tear 100 to stimulate the nerves in his eyes to increase tear production. He filled his gum pockets with a mixture of platelet-rich plasma, platelet-rich fibrin, and 50% bone. And he initiated something called Project Babyface in March of 2023, which is not clearly described, but seems to be the injection of fat into his face to make up for the fat that he lost from his face during his intense caloric restriction. His tissues are not universally young in age based on his measurements. His brain measurements, for example, are very close to his chronological age, ranging from 37 to 48. His VO2 max is very young, reflecting age 18. His HRV and resting heart rate are slightly younger than his chronological age at age 40 for HRV and age 37 for his RHR. But he has size and volume measurements of his heart ranging from ages 52 to 70 plus. And for skin measurements, he's got teenage measurements, he's got two 31-year-old and 41-year-old measurements, and he has 3 measurements of his skin that are between the ages of 50 and 70. His eye pressure is age 38, but his choroidal thickness is age 51 on the left and age 70 on the right, and his eyelash length, which he says is genetically short, is age 70 plus. For his ears, his ear function is generally higher than his age. Pinna is 30, left ear extended high frequency is 32, but right ear extended high frequency is age 60, left ear normal frequency is age 51, and right ear normal frequency is 61. None of these detract from the major achievements that he has made in getting some of these numbers down and getting incredibly fit. But this gives me the impression that his energy metabolism is not fully optimized to flow into the broad cross-tissue investment in longevity, but rather his physical training program gives him a great VO2 max. His topical treatments give him better than his genetics, hair, and skin. And his NAD precursor supplementation, whether it's NR or NMN, which he says are equivalent, improve his rate of DNA repair. But then there are many other things going on in his body that are contributing to some of the elevated levels of aging that we see, or some of the things like his brain measurements that indicate simply going along at the same as his chronological age would predict. So one of the missing ingredients that he has is functional markers of nutritional status. So I definitely think that his diet and supplements in combination are leading to very good status of many nutrients, and that this is going to offer protection of all sorts of damage, against all sorts of damage that occur with age. But he's missing important markers. His routine markers include blood concentrations of nutrients, but they don't include amino acids, organic acids, or enzyme activities that can be used as functional markers of nutrient status. You can have optimal concentrations of riboflavin in your blood, for example, but you can have elevated glutaric acid that goes down with riboflavin supplementation due to an increased genetic need. And this is very relevant to longevity because glutaric acid can cause an elevated rate of demyelination in the nervous system over time. Now, he tests riboflavin, but he doesn't test glutaric acid. Similarly, you can have optimal concentrations of thiamine in your blood, but you can have low activity of thiamine-dependent enzymes due to genetically increased needs for thiamine that raise things like alanine, glutamate, and lactate. Johnson tests thiamine, but not the amino acids, meaning alanine or glutamate, and not the lactate. In his monthly notes, he describes lowering the calcium alpha-glutarate supplementation from 4 grams to 2 grams due to a possible contribution to a slight increase in his resting heart rate. He was using a supplement that was calcium alpha-glutarate at 4 grams that would have given him 2.9 grams of the actual alpha-ketoglutarate acid. And when he decreased that supplement to 2 grams, that would have decreased his total AKG down to 1.45 grams. This could easily be explained by alpha-ketoglutarate failing to be cleared by the thiamine-dependent enzyme alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, and potentially backing up the B6-dependent clearance of glutamate to alpha-ketoglutarate, or even reversing that reaction to generate glutamate. Elevated levels of glutamate could lead to increased neurostimulation, which would raise his resting heart rate, and you could have easily seen this mechanistically what was happening on a plasma amino acid analysis. Now, there's many other examples. For example, each nutrient, every nutrient, has some kind of functional marker. The tryptophan metabolites, xanthronate, kynurenate, and quinolate, are functional markers of vitamin B6 status. The leucine metabolite beta-hydroxyisovalerate is a functional marker of biotin status. Methylmalonic acid is a functional marker of vitamin B12 status, and so on. Johnson is right to measure nutrient concentrations in his blood, but he should measure functional markers to see whether those nutrients are doing their jobs, and that would provide important insights into the results of his self-experiments in order to better explain them, as well as important insights into whether his nutrient status is truly optimized. I would add that some of his nutritional status interpretation is following an erroneous interpretive model. So 2 areas where I think this is relevant are, one, he looks at urea, because urea levels, the higher they are, the more mortality they predict. Now, urea is made from protein, but it goes up in the blood with age because kidney function goes down. So you have urea being a marker of poor kidney function, and then he hacks that test by lowering his protein intake to lower his urea. But the fact that he's lowering his protein intake to generate less urea in the first place does not mean that he's improving his kidney's clearance of the urea. And so I think that's an example where it's taking a marker that's correlated with longevity because of poor kidney function and then applying it to a totally unrelated thing like protein intake. And then in May of 2023, his plasma selenium came in at 416. He considered this slightly high because he was using the lab's reference range of 100 to 340 micrograms per liter, and he adjusted his Brazil nut intake down as a result. But the sweet spot for plasma selenium is around 120, which is optimal for cancer protection, and higher levels are clearly associated with an increased risk of diabetes and possibly associated with increased risk of cancer. So his levels are not slightly high, but they are actually dangerously high. The last of his missing ingredients, ranked and sorting genetics. So Johnson has described aspects of his genetics in his podcast, but he's not released any kind of comprehensive review of their contribution to his protocol. I believe he would benefit by ranking and sorting them according to the few that have the highest impact. In my experience, analyzing dozens of whole genome samples, everyone has heavily skewed mutations with fewer than 10 and often as few as 1 being orders of magnitude more important than anything else. These could be contributors to the increased nutrient needs that would raise functional markers of deficiency without altering blood levels of the nutrients. These could be creating idiosyncratic bottlenecks with huge returns on investment to address the impact of caloric restriction, whether he should be doing it at all or not, whether it's hurting or helping his anti-aging protocol, and how he can best optimize energy to flow down the path of least resistance. What he's missing then is these 3 things: ranked and sorted genetics, functional markers of nutrient status, and screening for bottlenecks of energy metabolism. So here's the bottom line. Johnson wants to bring longevity to the masses and to raise the health span and lifespan of the whole human race. I support that goal, and I believe that idiosyncrasies that make each of us unique are universal. While there are aspects of Johnson's protocol that will always be unique to him, deriving an approach to help each person figure out their own unique unlocks to their metabolism is something that can benefit everyone. The most impactful things Johnson is doing that we can all copy without signing our money and life away are eating a highly nutritious diet, maintaining a healthy body composition, and systematically testing nutrient status. The thing I think we can all dispense with is the extreme 25% caloric deficit. Most of us should probably go without even a 10% caloric deficit, and we probably don't need to be as extreme as he is about the regimented diet schedule or the extremely lean body composition. The 3 things missing from his recipe that we should all embrace for our own protocol are ranked and sorted genetics, functional markers of nutrient status, and comprehensive screening for impairments in energy metabolism. Now, this is not as easy as it sounds. The problems in particular with number 1 and number 3 in that list are as follows. In order to get the data that you need for ranking and sorting your genetics according to what has the most impact on your metabolism, you need whole genome sequencing. You cannot use SNP chip testing like 23andMe or like Ancestry, and you shouldn't even be using whole exome sequencing. You need whole genome sequencing. The problem is that the whole genome sequencing companies do not rank and sort your genetics according to what matters, and they do not do anything to help you find the very few, less than 10, probably 2 or 3, as few as 1, that the data show universally are present in people that form highly unique, highly actionable, and high impact bottlenecks on their metabolism. You need that data, but you need to go beyond that data in order to do the ranking and sorting that I'm talking about. And then with number 3, the comprehensive screening for impairments in energy metabolism, no one does these tests unless they are looking for diagnosable severe disorders in infancy and childhood, even though the data show that all of us have some level of impaired bottleneck in our metabolism that is in us acting as the principal limiter of our longevity. And so how do we go about doing this? Well, I have a protocol for this, and if you want to learn my protocol, head over to the video as well as the article that I made, How I Found My Health Super Unlock After 20 Years of Research and 20,000 Genes Tested, to find that piece of your ability to unlock your longevity.